when Rosie essentially issued a command upon me that I should speak about art in the Israel-Palestine situation, which I welcomed in the sense that it gives me an opportunity to return to my project on music and listening, and which I'm hoping soon to rescue from its being a 25-year-old side project. The occasional pieces that I've written over the years in this circle around the notion of transgressive listening, a notion I have yet been unable to define properly in any satisfactory way. But as nebulous as it may be, it is nonetheless a precise rendition of the nexus of problems that I've been concerned with, which do have music at the center, but extend to a broader sphere, chiefly the relation of music to the visual, the technological, and the political. And of course, here, Edward Said's thought on music is essential. So perhaps it would be helpful to begin by reminding us of how Said understood specifically the transgressive element of music. I quote 3 instances from musical elaborations. What I mean by transgression is something completely literal and secular at the same time. The faculty that music has to travel, cross over, drift from place to place in society, even though many institutions and orthodoxies have sought to confine it. So the transgressive element of music is both something literal and secular, and it is, in some ways, a certain kind of mobility. Perhaps we can say a certain translational capacity, if we were to take translation literally in the way that he's suggesting that we do, which would not make music something that is beyond the language, as it tends to often, following a certain romantic tradition, be thought of, but as something, perhaps we can say, translates language, translates languages even, and in some ways itself being a language of translation. Okay, the second quotation, secular transgression chiefly involves moving from one domain to another, the testing and challenging of limits, the mixing and intermingling of heterogeneities, cutting across expectations, providing unforeseen pleasures, discoveries, experiences. So there's a certain, not just a certain movement, but a certain crossing against the current, or crossing against the grain, if you will, that for Said is the significance of the secular. I'll come back to that in a minute. The final, third quotation, the transgressive element in music is its nomadic ability to attach itself to and become part of social formations, to vary its articulations and rhetoric depending on the occasion as well as the audience, plus the power and gender situations in which it takes place. So here, the transgressive element, nomadic as it is also in a certain, not just simply negative against the grain, but a certain kind of affirmative, perhaps attachment, an irreverent attachment, affiliation, if we want to use a Saidian language, that in fact changes, alters the situations. Now, there are various things we can say here about the secular, but this would lead us to another conversation. In passing, let us note that unlike much of the fashionable discourse nowadays, the bottom line of what Said signals as secular is what subverts established patterns and what enables connections between otherwise heterogeneous elements. The secular in this respect involves not only the dislocation and alteration of orthodoxies and authorities, but also a certain kind of movement, or the coincidence of the itinerant and the mutable, as I've argued elsewhere, a kind of endemic displacement against forces of confinement. To mind the musical metaphors, as the above quotations demand, the secular then is a mode of orchestrating disparate elements against the grain of established, expected, or confining associations, or arrangements, thereby undoing or altering situations and creating new and unforeseen possibilities. In this respect, Said argues, there is something intrinsically transgressive in the secular, and specifically music bears this out. I should say that it would not be the secularist. You would not find the word secularism in Said's writings. You find the word secular either as an adjective that is attached to a certain practice or as a certain substantive in this very conditional way that he speaks of it. I don't know, though, of any other occasion where Said associates this intrinsically transgressive element specifically with music, not with any other art form, an exclusivity that certainly, I think, bears a long discussion. I'm not even prepared necessarily to defend it. I'm presenting it. But for the sake of argument, let's just take it up axiomatically. It certainly does not mean, does not entail some sort of a romantic investment in music as superior to language or superior art form, nor, as we've said several times in relation, of course, to the discussion about the divan, nor does it mean a context where social antagonism can be wished away in some kind of harmonious coexistence. In fact, if anything, it's quite the opposite. So my focus today is on two scenes, two episodes, that illustrate this transgressiveness of music. I will mainly focus on Lebanese musician and artist Mazen Kerbaj on a specific occasion that will surprise you if you don't know it. But I do want to open with something perhaps more familiar, at least in terms of a certain aesthetic gesture, which is, however, a concise illustration of what Said is presenting. This is a clip. Unfortunately, I don't have clips of my dear mother to show you. You know, Greek mothers and Jewish mothers, you know, very close, very little difference. Alas, I don't have that. But I think that you will find this clip quite interesting, and you probably know it already. Let's see if we can. It's from the film Divine Intervention by Elia Suleiman, but it's really the music that's the key here more than anything else. Okay, let me see, where are we? All right, now you, I suspect, recognize the song. I Put a Spell on You, a classic R&B tune, written in 1956 by Screaming Jay Hawkins and performed by him with inimitable voodoo extravaganza. I'll give you an idea what this looks like. No, I don't have time to do the performance. Oops. There it is. Okay, the song has been covered in various ways by a dozen artists, the most memorable being the one by Nina Simone in 1965, which bears not only a musical innovation, an added motif of horn and string arrangements, but a radical shift in affect and meaning, which makes it the undeniable precursor of this song. I'll talk about Nina Simone in a minute. This is an equally innovative rendition by Natasha Atlas, originally recorded in Cairo with Egyptian musicians and Atlas's old band Transglobal Underground in 2001, a year before the Suleiman film. There is an incredible live performance of her doing the song on YouTube, but with a band that's definitely worth seeing. I have written extensively about Suleiman's specific mode of filmmaking, which if you don't know, you got a sense of it here, in the context of Palestinian cinema as a cinema of occupation and dispossession. I won't rehearse it here except to say that Suleiman's films are distinct in the sense that they deliberately undermine the primacy of spoken language, opting instead for what, borrowing from Brecht, we can call a gestic idiom. The characters in Suleiman's films, starting from the filmmaker who cast himself as the protagonist, hardly ever utter a word. Hence, the hyperextension of an almost documentary visuality, even in parts that extend to pure fantasy. Because Suleiman's films also lack any sort of action in the typical cinematic sense, we are treated to a hypervisuality of the banal. Indeed, what Suleiman calls, this is his phrase, the choreography of the banality of life, produces a curious cinematic design, alternately wondrous and frustrating, evocative and confusing, alarming and hypnotizing, at times hilarious and at other times unnerving, hence the puzzle responses of many viewers, whether in the film community or the public at large. In this muted and inactive cinematic design, one can see how important music can become, as Brecht himself, after all, understood music to reside at the core of the gestic universe. Here, Suleiman additionally draws from the gestus of the music video genre. You can see how that's being used here. The film literally illustrates the song by depicting acts of spellbinding. First, at the stoplight where the protagonist hypnotizes an Israeli nationalist, in all likelihood a settler, and second, at the Al-Aram checkpoint, where whatever passes as action in the film takes place throughout, where by proxy of the Arafat balloon, the protagonist hypnotizes the guards. In this sense, the music enacts a passage. In the second case, literally, they cross the checkpoint, but in the first, I would argue, a passage from dispossession to possession. A spell, after all, belongs to the discursive order of possession. I put a spell on you because you're mine. The lyric etiologizes what is already announced in the word spell and instantly corroborated by the image of the spellbinding stare. The spellbound Israeli turns his head exactly at the interpellation of you. I don't know if you noticed that, right? I put a spell on you. It's at that point that he turns his head. In the song, but it is the language of the song that casts the spell actually, not the stare behind the dark sunglasses. This is what, in fact, I would understand to be Brecht's gestic music idea. So yes, we see the dark glasses, but the spell is cast by the music, by the song. In this sense, the visual choreography of stares in the shot-countershot sequence subjectivizes what the song proposes, so that facial images come to take the place of the pronouns I, you. So the lyric resonates transgressively in a whole other situation, as Said understands transgression. That is to say, enabling a whole other situation by moving against the confinements of genre and context. The song bears a rather typical blues lyric about a problem relationship. I put a spell on you because you're mine, you better stop the things you do, I ain't lying, I can't stand it when you're running around, I can't stand it when you put me down, I put a spell on you because you're mine. As I mentioned, the precursive transgression has already taken place when Nina Simone radically altered the conventional gendering of a bluesman's complaint by additionally tampering both with the song's melody and its arrangement. And I suggest, again, you seek out this rather famous version. Simone registered more than a rendition. She created an original, which not only secured a memorable place in music history, and specifically within the music history of black song on its own right, but spawned a whole other range of possibilities, especially for other women singers. Natasha Atlas, in this respect, draws more from Nina Simone than from the screaming Jay Hawkins original. She transgresses this nexus further, of course, by a kind of unabashed orientalization that takes shape through the contemporary music elements of the time, a kind of ethno-trance or trip-hop sound, which constitutes her recognizable musical style. Suleiman's casting of the song's gestus is yet a further step in this trail of transgression. A love lyric that is initially woven around a play of possession in more ways than one is thrown by the film into a terrain of dispossession. A Palestinian confronts an Israeli settler and then a host of checkpoint guards. Thus, you better stop the things you do, or I can't stand it when you put me down, those verses, take up a whole other meaning as indexes of dispossession, as do the affirmations, I ain't lying, or the core lyric itself, I put a spell on you because you're mine. You understand how this staging radicalizes the claim, you're mine, as a kind of dialectical reversal, a dispossession of dispossession, if you allow me the Hegelianism. This is dramatized even further in the checkpoint scene, where this dispossession of dispossession enables the unchecked passage of two Palestinians into Jerusalem, where a whole other and of enormous gravity framework of possession is indeed played out. Now we'll move to my next piece. I'll continue and we'll, let me see if I put another image on here. Okay, all right. The second episode, Sometimes one can apprehend history through the coordination, intersection, or coexistence, that's the word symphony, of anonymous sounds. We suppose that all sounds begin and end in some name, but we rarely really know it. In all cases, however, the time, place, and name bear a relentless precision. On the night of July 15th, 2006, Mazen Kerbaj came out on the terrace of his home in Beirut to play his trumpet. He had no audience, no public. He did have, however, a fellow player. On the hill across the way, he could even see this player. He could see and feel the catastrophic reverberations of Israeli bombers. Kerbaj came out on his terrace to play a duet with the bombs. There is no musician, even the most solitary and ascetic, who can handle her singularity. Even when self-enclosed in one's own sound, and there have been many great such musicians in all sorts of epochs who continue to magnetize us. Even when self-enclosed in one's own sound, one must at some point emerge from one's abode. Music itself makes this exit certain. Even if you have dedicated yourself to the most hermetically closed solo, you are riveted by an unsurpassable otherness. You wrestle with some instrument. You try to master it or submit to it, but whichever way, the music emerging out of you emerges through it, even if this instrument is your own body, your vocal cords. Even when you sing on your own, unaccompanied, you are speaking out into the night or day. Mediation coexists even with the most uncompromising immediacy, which is your own body. Like all other art forms, music can emerge out of solitude, but automatically, materially, it dissolves this solitude. This is because sound itself is a musician's closest companion, even when it is confronted as an enemy in one's most desperate nights, say, for instance, the last nights of Charlie Parker in March of 1954 in some wretched downtown LA hotel, when he would set fire to the bed and play saxophone next to the trash bins with intoxicated insanity. Practically of the same age as was then the hapless legendary saxophonist, Mazen Kerbaj perhaps had the advantage that history knocked on his door with utter clarity and wholeness, not as the dark and murky fate of a free black man in America. The comparison ultimately is not the issue. Kerbaj felt that the Israeli planes bombarding his city for several nights already could no longer keep him locked up indoors. He came out on his terrace to greet them, to confront them on his own battlefield, sound to sound. Not sound against sound, here's the key difference. Kerbaj came out on his terrace one sweet summer night in Beirut to confront those who were ruining it, not going against them, but playing with them, accompanying their sound and thereby altering their exclusive mark. Now we'll play a part from this very long and extraordinary piece. This is just music, no images. It requires quietness. going to stop it. It's going to take another 3 minutes. We don't have time, but we really actually would need to fully go into it. The bombs recur. This thing goes on. It's actually a 20-minute piece, which he's put out 6 minutes. Okay, here we go. Oops. All right. We'll give this another picture of him. You can see him. So Kerbaj doesn't, as you noticed, right, doesn't play trumpet as one would expect. Certainly in this specific musical interaction with the bombs, I didn't do it justice because I should have let it go, but we don't have time. He strips his instrument from any recognizable reference to whatever musical traditions may inform it. He evades any traditionally coded note as if he's trying to find, through a musical instrument, the sonic grammar of breath itself. He often uses just the mouthpiece, which he connects directly to the amplifier or various other gadgets or distortion effects. In the photograph you have here, he's sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by various musical toys, and his playing seems to be akin to smoking a hookah. The recording begins with an almost inaudible sound of crickets, interrupted occasionally by the distant barking of a dog, sounds of a city deserted by humans, when even at a distance, nature can be heard. The trumpet follows exactly this ineffable motif, a hard-pressed exhalation, as if a weakened mouth is wrestling to breathe against the world. Then a momentary silence. When the first bomb explodes, and then immediately the second and third, the trumpet sound happens to be at a point where you almost think that it too is about to explode, not in a high frequency, but rather as something rumbling and turgid, like a wound straining to open. Along with the bombs, the sound of the city return, sirens, ambulances, car alarms. And then the long baritone sound of airplanes echoing the bombs they leave behind, the unwaning sound of destruction. Kerbaj does not lower the scale of his exhalation. It now seems that the trumpet seeks to get to know the bombs up close. It falls into bizarre bass depths that don't actually exist in the trumpet range, but they exist in the musician, who through a trumpet expresses what keeps him living. Indeed, if there is something immediately emerging from this synod, is that a man tries to inscribe the traces of his life intact, that is to say, his very own breath, on the traces of history that destroys him. We can only wonder at the brave irony that brings the musician to call the piece he records on the terrace Starry Night. That's the title he's given it. The history in which he consciously intervenes, the history which at this moment, through his crazy idea to bring it into music, he transgresses, is here rendered as nature. Nature by distortion, of course. Music here manifests the hidden nature of history. It reinscribes history on the motifs of nature, not in order to freeze it, to immortalize it as art, kind of a nature morte sort of thing, but to highlight the fact that its consequences touch upon the depths of human earthly nature. Here, history does not merely destroy history, does not annihilate the creations of a society. It kills and irreparably alters nature itself. It destroys lives, pollutes the seas, threatens the planet. The sort of music that does not make its way beyond reality has little to say. Surely such music does not even make its way out from within reality. It remains ignorant of what produces it, of what allows it even to exist, and so this music is mute. It says nothing. On the contrary, whatever makes its way out from within reality has the power to make its way beyond it, even if this doesn't often happen. Kerbaj achieved something unique. He chose to play straight up against reality and simultaneously to reach beyond it, to create through it and from within it a sort of music that is perfectly unreal. In Starry Night shines precisely what outshines the stars, the bombs, but also what the bombs cannot quite efface, something that shines beyond the light because it's something that resounds along with the bombs in an outrageous duet, and yet beyond the bombs. No doubt, it matters a great deal that this iterative moment was consciously recorded, thus effacing at once its ephemeral singularity. To carry out the gesture of a music that makes its way outside of reality, Kerbaj thought and took up the responsibility not only to record this moment, but to release it in the internet. That is, he didn't merely immortalize the moment, he didn't extinguish the unrepeatable nature of the moment like a snapshot, but he surrendered to the most relentless regime of repetition that exists in our time. I doubt there's another document of the 2006 Israeli bombing of Beirut registered with such immediacy. Surely there must exist archive reportage of all kinds and all purposes. And there may even be private footage. The probability nowadays is high. But it's certain that no other such double document exists. Double because it records the reality of history, but also the history of another reality, not parallel, but intersecting. A reality that is other precisely because though it emerges from the hard imposition of a conjuncture, nonetheless dares play with a conjuncture on its own terms, transforming it in the very instance of recording it indelibly as history. The case of Kerbaj is no accident. For more than a decade now, he has resided at the center of a powerful, even if not widely known, movement in the art and music sphere of Beirut, which demonstrates directly how this multiply destroyed city manages to retain its unmasterable creative tradition, which characterizes it throughout the 20th century as the most cosmopolitan and experimental art space in the Arab world. I would argue that one of the ways to account for the vehemence with which the Israeli army has repeatedly demolished the infrastructure of this city beyond the purposes of strategic interest has to do with its unwillingness to accept the capacity of Arabs to blossom as a modern secular society. Israel would always prefer the image of Arabs as a fanatic and uncivilized mob incapable of creating and managing any conditions of autonomy. And I would like to suggest that this incredible scene that Rob Nixon showed us yesterday of the cutting down of the olive trees in a Palestinian village is in fact quite analogous to this, and I would even go further, obviously I can't develop it here, that the destruction of the tradition is also a destruction of secular life. Kerbaj is at the forefront of a circle of musicians and artists that deserves to be called avant-garde. As a musician, he belongs to a space deriving from the aesthetics of 60s jazz, and specifically the chief expressions of free improvisations we find in America at the time. We can go through tons of names: Sandra Orchestra, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, I can go on, Albert Eiler, etc. Along with them exists a subsequent but broad European experimental jazz tradition, chiefly in Britain, France, Germany, and Scandinavia, but also more eccentrically, and in fact clandestinely, in the Czechoslovakia of the Soviet period. The Lebanese musicians that experiment in this genre are impressively learned and skilled, not at all plagiarists of a certain mannerism. In fact, in their inventiveness breathes new life to another domain that characterizes the European tradition: electroacoustic music and musique concrète. This is a whole scene that is really worth researching and listening to at extraordinary time. 5 minutes, wow. That's not going to be possible. I'm like the Udi now. Well, maybe, it might be possible. Okay. At the same time, Kerbaj has distinguished himself perhaps even more than his musicianship as a painter and graphic artist. His sketches don't actually show a refined technique, but rather his approach testifies to an explosive improvisationalism analogous to his music. During the 2006 bombings, Kerbaj emerged at the forefront by producing more than a dozen sketches a day in an effort to document, much like he did with the piece that we heard, not only the history of a city under bombardment, but how this history is undercut by an everyday reality that does not subside a mode of living that resists any prospect of subjugation and annihilation. From this standpoint, the sketches, and I can start showing some of them. Here's one of them. From this standpoint, the sketches, like the musical duet with the bombs on the terrace, become documents not of an occasion in which history becomes present, but an occasion where history is created, even when one is acting defensively and on the run against the threat of mass death and without any sort of military prospect of resistance. His gesture of putting out on the internet a fragment from the terrace recording is an extension of this mode of living. It is the same mode that prompted many Lebanese, but also Israelis, to begin blog journals from the outset of the war. In his own blog, he puts these things up. You can always look these things up. It's quite amazing. In his own blog, Kerbaj hardly ever speaks. And in this sense, too, he's innovative if we consider that blogging is the quintessential chattering genre. He mainly posts bunches of sketches, occasionally accompanying them with laconic quips, sometimes in verse mode. These tiny poems, if we can call them that, are not performed exclusively in a literary domain. What may be called literally a poem is the aggregate of sketch plus verse. The visuality of this artistic pair remains foundational. The verses work to make the image denser. You can see this one. This one is very small. I don't know how well it can be seen. No doubt the internet has radically changed the conditions of production and reception of art. The fact that any artist can automatically, in a second, send out whatever fragments of fantasy to a receptive space, which in essence has no limits of reproducibility, makes this an incredible occasion. We can say that this new horizon of possibility returns to the artist a big part of the ownership of the means of production that is otherwise revoked by the market. At the same time, however, it forces the artist to abandon the demand from the mechanisms of the market, publication, advertising, distribution, sales, etc., to protect and promote the artwork. Generally speaking, the dissemination of the artwork on the internet presupposes a substantial distanciation of the artist from the work, or even more, the reconciliation of the artist with the fact that the artwork will be disseminated as a simulacrum. The object as such, the specific sculpture, painting, or literary book or as artwork, can continue to exist in a parallel life of much narrower purview and without exclusivity. I'm coming to my final page. It's no longer useful, it seems to me, perhaps it's even pointless, to believe that we need to choose between these two lives. Those who have nostalgia for the original artifact should not forget that we are all, without exception, subjected to the fetishism of commodities. Paradoxically, the unknown public that comes into contact with sketches or the music of Kerbaj on the internet, which is a public out of place and out of time in relation to the work's conditions of production, evades this logic of commodity fetishism. Of course, it's but a momentary evasion, as ephemeral as is one's passage from one website to another. This is not the most interesting aspect of the problem. What matters are questions that emerge from these conditions, which concern specifically this notion of public. How do we understand the notion of internet public? How can we speak of public when the encounter with the artwork or any document of reality takes place so exclusively in private in front of an individual's digital screen? What is the space of commons, public, between all these solitary figures across the multilateral spaces around the globe, when out of place and out of time they encounter the simulacrum of the same artwork on a website? In the Kerbaj case, at least concerning the musical duet with the bombs, the reaction was massive and immediate, even if mostly negative. While bombardments were continuing, a substantial part of the public not only refused to entertain this act as an artwork, but rather deemed it to be blasphemous against both art and reality. And while he was accused for aestheticizing war and destruction, he was also constructed as an internet and television news item. Kerbaj refused any invitation to take part in a discussion on camera, therefore retaining control of the means of reproduction of the specific gesture, and thereby clearly distinguishing between the internet and the satellite televisual image as a media of translation of both the artwork and the creative thought behind it. This is my last slide and my last paragraph, I think. Oh no, this is really, this is incredible too. It's quite documentary, and then this last one is, I think, quite indicative. Kerbaj insists that this blog does not engage in politics, that it simply invests reality with art. But this art is interwoven with reality. It doesn't merely interpret reality, not merely document it. It also interrupts it and alters it. Kerbaj's reality, contrary to the one of most of us who live in conditions of settled somnambulance, obviously has a different relation to art. In our reality, art counts when it unsettles our condition, so much in fact that we may desire to return to the safety of our somnambulance, but we can't. The very realization of this pathetic desire, if in fact we even get to it, may make possible an awakening that will then lead us elsewhere. But in Kerbaj's case, reality is what everyone is trying to get away from, and here art does the exact opposite. It remains in the place of dispossession, even while it retains an investment in reality's possession. Thank you.
I have a comment rather than a question about the issue of non-violence as a tool of, as art as a tool of non-violent practices. I want to share with you the idea that the Palestinian Israel, since 1948, since the Nakba, have been resisting Israel via non-violence practices. And this haven't been articulated as much as I know in the general West academia. So when we are talking about Palestinian resistance, we are non-violent Palestinian resistance, we are talking neither about the art or about Bil'in, which resisting the wall. So Elia Suleiman, for example, the one you show us the film, is a Palestinian from Israel. The film Paradise Now was produced also by Hani Awasad, which is, he is also Palestinian from Israel. Right. Adi Khalif and other persons that the West also know about that. So I feel a little bit suffocated when I listening to this lecture, while just talking about the art as a tool of a non-violent resistance. And it's not you, I'm telling
That's
about
okay.
the session, that and the practices of the Palestinian Israel, the daily practices of against the house demolitions, the demonstrations in the cases of appropriation of the land. So concentrating the whole our view or point on the occupation that took place in 1967, it makes us eliminate or forget the unviolent resistance of Palestinians since the Nakba. Okay, and thank you for this very compelling conference.
Thank you.
No, I thank you also for your comment. We're taking other questions? Go ahead.
Couple more.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for this nice talk. I am Mohammed Nimr from Palestine as well. I have questions for both speakers, and maybe the point I'm raising here is the concept of secular representation, which you mentioned, a transgressive representation. It's very important for me as someone who really researched the topic of the role of the intellectual between academia and the public sphere. So my idea here is that secular criticism itself is a form of representation. To what extent do you think that can the intellectual transgress the institutional paradigm and speak to the public sphere, and in what ways? Art of representation is one form, but there are pertinent issues, which is political and more pertinent human, that should be addressed, that we need, of course, the intellectual to address. This is one point. The other point, I didn't see any concentration on the concept of amateurism that really intellectual, that Said...
Sorry, the concept of what? I didn't hear.
The concept of amateurism, the amateur intellectual, because I feel that this is central, okay, to his, Said's representation. He's not the first one to do that, as far as you know. Okay, Bliss Berry, okay, in the beginning of the last century, in his book, the Spirit Amateur, referred to this point and elaborated. But I found that this is strategic in his ideas, and starting from beginnings, Orientalism, and even covering Islam, till representation of the intellectual, I found him strategically behind this topic against professionalism, although he himself professional. So to what extent do you think that intellectuals should insinuate this amateurism, professionalism, and contribution between inside and outside public sphere and the private sphere as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a third question here, and I will close with that.
Thank you very much. I think maybe my question in part follows from the first question, which is how to think about Said in relationship to music. And it struck me this morning, or earlier today at least, I'm not quite sure what time zone I'm on, that Marina was talking a bit about how Said works in a highly contextual and historical way. And I was thinking about his relationship to Mozart and to opera in particular, and to what extent, and it raised the question for me of what the relationship is between music and the possibility of the transposition of one context into another. In other words, he works contextually and historically, and yet what seems to happen time and again when he turns to music is that he's really interested in the transposition of context, or the transposability of a musical score from context to context. Now, it seems to me that it's that last feature that becomes, I think, nearly a formalism in Stathis's suggestion that that music is transgressive, or has a or to the degree that it can be understood as secular, or perhaps in its secular dimension, it is by definition transgressive. And it struck me that maybe there was a little tension between the analysis of what it is to move from one historical context to another, the conditions and limits of transposability, we might say, and a kind of definitional quality of transgressiveness, which strikes me as a stronger claim, and one that I'm not sure would be fully compatible with the kind of analysis that Marina has offered us.
Thank you, Judith.
Okay.
Stathis, would you like to start with three
I will
sets
do
of
very
questions?
quickly, if I can. First of all, the comment about I can only thank you about your comment. I was thinking about it in the previous discussion. Of course, I was thinking about this issue. For me, I'm not a person that thinks that violent resistance should be revoked from the field. I think that. I'm not talking about this particular case, any case. If a people is subjugated to violence on a daily basis, this violence is already there. I mean, it's not a question of simply just saying, well, you shouldn't really you have no access to violence, basically. It's worse in that sense. However, we cannot say at the same time, I feel that we cannot put on some kind of balance sheet the violence versus non-violence aspects. These are coexisting, even to call them tactics is in fact terribly limiting. They're coexisting modes of practice. And art is of course tends to be on the side of nonviolence, but it can also be in certain specific contexts, and I'll come to the question of context, which is important, obviously. In certain contexts, violent. It could create terrible disturbance. It can be considered scandalous, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to document, just as it's important to document the history of violent resistance in this specific case, like Amir Mufti did yesterday, first day in his discussion of the Fedayeen. I mean, that was forgotten. It seemed to be taken out of history. The same way, it's important to document gestures of nonviolence without fetishizing them or privileging them. That's for me important. Now, the thing about the secular, that's a very long discussion, but there is no doubt about the fact that, and hasn't been discussed enough, and Edward didn't live long enough for us to discuss it further, that there's a shift, literally in language, from secular criticism to democratic criticism in the last book. This is not something that we should just ignore. I don't know what to say about it, but I'm noting it. It seems to me that in his work about the one-state solution in that period, his argument was that this is only possible in a secular universe, in a democratic society, where the particularities of identity would be left intact, but would not be the primary ground on which society is defined, right? We can debate what secular means here in relation to religion and so on, but if we really need to give ground to at least that, at least in the sense that he was thinking. The same is true about this thing about being an amateur. He was relentlessly critical of discourses of expertise. He thought that discourses of expertise must be combated vehemently. This is the language of the State Department. They're the languages of people who think they know. Orientalism, of course, being one of the great discourses of expertise. So the amateur element is linked to a certain kind of openness. An amateur can be incredibly skilled and terribly knowledgeable, but it's one's relation to the practice which is much more open and experimental than the one of the expert and specialist who controls the mode. The last thing, well, Judith, this is, my interpretation would be that, in fact, and I think that it can be demonstrated in the writing, that though Said was a profoundly historical thinker and geographical thinker, remember that two things go together, meaning with great attention to context and precision, he was nonetheless interested in various aspects, particularly in the arts, but also in thinking. Not when the discussion about theory would come in here, the whole discussion, but let's say art, it's easier, that would decontextualize things, that would be able to strain the limits of context. This didn't mean that, I don't consider that to be a contradiction. I think that his attention to context was so precise that he sought out those elements that strained the limits of context. And music being paradigmatic. And this, okay, that is his choice. And in that famous piece about Brahms, he talks about the music of his music, which is it's something that's even beyond the actual music, the notes, the performances. There's something about that, Brahms, that is the music of his music, that is a completely decontextualizing statement. So I favor the decontextualizing gesture in his thinking, and I consider part of secular criticism, so long as, of course, we don't forget the historical, etc. That's my quick responses.
Thanks, Stathis. Maria?
I think the point is about secularism is that actually it says red. Is that on? Okay. I think the point about secularism is that actually this is a place where there is an instructional value in the kind of literature that comes out of the Arabic world. Because the opening line of the Arabian Nights is an invocation to Allah, but it's a profane work. It's a work of entertainment, joy, and transgression. I mean, there's absolutely no obedience to any religious tenet as principles of moral education. This is a festive and kind of effervescent work. But all the way through, there is a cosmology, and so it actually breaks down completely this distinction, which I think should not remain in place. And one of the ways, very interesting that we can bring it straight into opera, because one of the things that happens with performance around the end of the 18th century, and the French Revolution learnt this very well, is that they used the methods of religious event to inform the cultural sphere very effectively. I mean, you may not like it, but these were very strong thought experiments and very strong thought manipulation that took place with something like the Feast of Reason. Mozart comes along with his librettist and makes an opera, Magic Flute, one of Edward's favorite operas, which is about Freemasonry, which is exactly this transposition of the religious sphere into a secular sphere, but fusing the two to make an allegory of illumination, an allegory of the achievement of love, the achievement of the dissolving of oppositions. I mean, we could talk about the plot of the Magic Flute. So I think that actually, to go to Judith's point, if we keep to the idea of the Magic Flute, Edward's interest in context means that if you come to re-perform the Magic Flute, you must remember its roots in this dialectical enlightenment opposition of good and evil. And it's only by knowing that context that you can come along and do it differently, transgressively. You cannot perform the transgression without knowing the context. It is absolutely essential to engage with the work in its own time in order to identify those elements that are the ones you do not want now, or you want to expose for now, so that we see more what they're doing. And actually the Magic Flute is a perfect example because it's actually rather pernicious. I mean, it had its function, but the sort of Sarastro stuff is not really very attractive to us now. We see through it. So, and Edward Said actually, I mean, we adore the music, but you know. But Edward actually, of course, really, really loved Peter Sellers' work. He praises him, very, very profoundly, even when Peter Sellers had a kind of, didn't have a success. He made Don Juan a heroin addict, and that wasn't very successful. But, even when and he criticized that in his music criticism. But even when he did that, he still liked the fact that Peter Sellers was very transgressive against the works that he was recreating, revisioning for our time. But I also think that actually this is a structural conflict within Edward's thinking. And I did feel it myself very strongly when I was trying to do a Saidian homage with my book on the Arabian Nights, because I was in contest with some of the principles that he'd laid out, as he himself was, I think. I mean, I don't mean to claim, I'm not sort of claiming anything there. I'm just saying that, and Paul Gilroy, when he talked about humanism and anti-humanism, but this, I think, is a productive conflict. One wants to sort of live with this difficulty, live in this doubt. We have inherited works of art that are, in a sense, conformist, that deeply entrench otherness, that do, many, as the Magic Flute does. But yet, we can grasp them and then wrestle with them. And I did think Stathis's paper was fascinating about these contemporary musicians, and especially Kerbaj. This is amazing work. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there one more burning question? We ran out of time, and I have to bring it to close, but so with one last question. Amir.
Thank you, both of you, for these very interesting presentations. I think I probably just have an observation than a question. Your talks were in very different registers, even though very much concerned with aesthetic issues and issues of form. I thought in quite different registers. There's a way, it just occurred to me now that, are you familiar with Emily Jasser's work, Material for a Film, the Palestinian artist?
No, not me.
Yes. Part of this artwork is 100 copies of 1001 Nights with a bullet embedded in each copy. And the work is an homage to, of course, Wael Zoueter, the very young Palestinian intellectual assassinated in Rome in 1972, the revenge killings of Palestinian intellectuals and writers by the Mossad in revenge for the Munich Olympic operation. And I'm just wondering if, if there's something incredibly powerful about that, and if it might lead you to rethink the way in which you are considering the Arabian, the Alf Layla Walayla as a kind of work, as a kind of presence in our world. I'm sorry, I'm very jet-lagged. I'm not making much sense here. In other words, it seems to me that there is a way in which the Palestinian version of the Arabian Nights comes with a bullet in it, and it's one of the bullets that was meant for, one of the bullets that was shot at Wael Zoueter, it got embedded in the copy of the Arabian Nights that he was carrying with him. And that is what the artwork in some ways...
Do you mean the bullet in the Arabian Nights is a bullet within the text of what the text is saying, or the stories are saying, or do you mean that it is the target, which, I mean, it is a kind of symbol of the target?
Well, I think what Emily Jasser is doing in that artwork is to precisely make a certain passage from the one to the other, from the one to the other in some ways, okay? And I'm wondering if in some ways our consideration of something like the Arabian Nights, with its very complex Orientalist history and all of that, and the way in which it gets retransported back to a certain Arabic literary tradition out of its European reception, is in fact not indexed very powerfully by this image of the bullet in Jasser's work.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not being very
No, thanks very much. What I will do is actually, if she wants, I will give the final word to...
No, I just want to... I don't know if I misheard you, Amir, but my recollection is the art that Emily Jasser did. Zoueter was killed in Rome, and he had the Arabian Nights in his pocket. And then she takes the pages, and each page shows where the bullet is. I don't know if you said it, but... and then she has the art.
Thanks very much. I think what I'd like to stay at is that's the beginning of a wonderful another conversation. And let's continue that after the break.